Let's talk about 2026, a year when two massive, world-changing events happened almost on top of each other. First, the final explosive release of the Jeffrey Epstein Files, and then the outbreak of war with Iran. Now, on the surface, those two things have absolutely nothing to do with each other. But the sources we're digging into today ask a pretty provocative question. What if they did? All right, so let's really get into it. We're going to unpack a really complex theory, one that's detailed in our source materials. It tries to connect the dots between a huge domestic scandal and a major international war. It's a story about secrets, power, and, just maybe, the hidden forces that shape our world. Okay, but before we can even get to the wild theory itself, we have to set the stage. Because the release of these files wasn't some quiet, orderly process. No, it was an absolute political firestorm. I mean, just look at this timeline. It tells you everything you need to know about the incredible pressure behind this. A vote of 427 to 1 in the House, unanimous consent in the Senate. It went from being introduced to being signed into law in just over 4 months. You just don't see that. This thing was a political freight train, and it had nearly everyone on board.
But, and this is a huge but, here's where things start to feel off. On one hand, you've got President Trump calling the whole thing a hoax and a scam, but then he signs the bill into law anyway. Meanwhile, his own Department of Justice is dragging its feet, missing the legal deadline, spending almost $1 million on redacting stuff, and then releasing documents where entire pages are just blacked out. That kind of contradiction, well, that's what got people really suspicious.
And this quote right here from Representative Thomas Massie, who was a huge supporter of the bill, he basically says what a lot of people were thinking. The fear wasn't just about a delay. The real fear was that this was all just a smokescreen, a deliberate effort to control what the public got to see. All right, so let's get into what was actually in the files. Because once the documents finally started coming out, even with all the redactions, they contained some absolutely jaw-dropping claims. And these claims, they're the foundation for this entire theory. So, what are we talking about here? Get this. According to a New York Times review of just one single batch of these released files, Donald Trump's name came up more than 38,000 times. 38,000. Now, to be clear, a lot of those mentions were totally innocent. Flight logs, stuff like that. But then you get things like this. An unverified tip sent to the FBI. And while our sources are quick to point out that some of the details don't really line up with the known facts, it didn't matter. Just releasing something this explosive to the public was an absolute bombshell. Okay, but this is where the whole story pivots from a political scandal to something else entirely. This quote you see, that's not from some random blog or an opinion piece. That's a direct quote from a declassified FBI memo. And it doesn't stop there, not even close. The very same memo claims from a confidential source that Jeffrey Epstein himself was a co-opted Mossad agent, Israel's spy agency. It even alleges he was trained by a former Israeli prime minister, Ehud Barak. I mean, think about that. An allegation like that sitting in an official government file, it changed the entire conversation. So you're probably asking, okay, this is wild, but what does any of it have to do with the war in Iran? Well, to connect those dots, the sources tell us we have to pull way back and look at the bigger geopolitical game board, specifically at a strategic plan that's been talked about for decades. It's called the Yinon Plan. It comes from this paper published way back in 1982, and the basic idea is pretty shocking. For Israel to be truly secure, it has to be the unquestioned power in the region. And how do you do that? You balkanize your neighbors. You break up the big, powerful Arab states around you into smaller, weaker, feuding statelets. And who were the targets, according to this plan? Well, you're looking at them. Iraq, split into 3. Egypt, Syria, and Lebanon, all weakened and fractured. The goal, as laid out in this strategy, is pretty clear. Leave Israel as the last one standing, the undisputed regional superpower. Okay, so now we have all the pieces on the board, right? We've got the political chaos, the explosive files, and this grand geopolitical strategy. So how do they all fit together? Well, this brings us to the core of the theory, what some have called the Epstein dagger. This quote right here says it all. The idea isn't just that the files were embarrassing. The theory is they were a weapon, a tool for blackmail, a dagger pointed right at the presidency. So according to this theory, the whole thing was a calculated 3-step scheme.
Step 1, you hit Trump with the files, linking him to Epstein in thousands of ways. Step 2, you reveal your leverage, showing official documents that claim he's compromised by Israel and that Epstein was their asset. And what's the final move? The checkmate. You use all that pressure to force him to do something he might not otherwise do. Launch a war against Iran, a top target of that Yinon Plan. So if you follow that logic to its conclusion, the sources ask a really important question. If this war wasn't about protecting America, then who was it really for? Who benefited? Let's follow the money. One source we looked at pointed to a Princeton study, and the number is just staggering. Just to keep U.S. aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf between 1976 and 2007, it cost American taxpayers $57.3 trillion. Trillion, with a T. And that was before this new war even started. And that's just the cost of parking our ships there. It doesn't even count the direct aid and weapons deals. You're looking at tens of billions of dollars locked up in deals with Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. Israel alone gets around $3 billion a year from the U.S., which is about a sixth of our entire foreign aid budget for the whole world. The amount of money flowing into this region is just immense. So the argument our sources make is this. This conflict, with its unbelievable cost in American lives and dollars, isn't really about U.S. national security. They argue it's about fulfilling the strategic goals of an ally while funneling a fortune into the defense industry, which, let's be honest, gets rich off of this kind of instability. So there you have it. That's the theory, laid out in our sources, that connects a sordid political scandal to a massive global conflict. It's a web of alleged blackmail, deep state secrets, and decades-old geopolitical ambitions. And it leaves us all with one pretty chilling question to think about.